Hello, everyone. Today we have Chris Doxey with us today for our podcast Managing Risk, Top 20 P2P Controls. Chris has held senior finance and controller positions at Digital Equipment Corporation, Compaq, and Hewlett-Packard. She was also recruited to lead WorldCom in the implementation of internal control standards, policies, and corporate governance processes. Chris has a bachelor's degree in English, a bachelor's in accounting, a master's in business administration, and has a graduate certificate in project management. She is a certified accounts payable professional and holds a certification in control self-assessment. She is also a certified internal controls auditor and a certified professional controller. So thanks a lot, Chris, for joining us on this podcast. Now, without further ado, let's start this podcast. To put things into perspective, let's start from the most basic yet most important question. Where is the biggest risk in the P2P process?
That's a really good question. The biggest risk in the P2P process starts with us taking a look at the internal controls universe. And if we take a look at making sure we establish the tone at the top for internal controls, and that's going to cut across, of course, processes, our systems, and, of course, our entity, which is our company. But if we start to really take a look at where's the biggest problem within the P2P process, it really starts with making sure we have the right suppliers set up in our supplier master. And if we have the data correct, then we are going to make sure that our invoice is going to be processed properly and our payments are going to be processed properly. And my premise is that if we have the data correct in the supplier master, everything else is going to flow properly throughout the process. And that's, I think, where we can really prevent the risk from being a problem, and we're going to make sure our suppliers are real. And if that's the case, then we're going to have good invoice processes and good payment processes. So very good question, and that's going to help us prevent fraud and detect fraud in a timely manner. Okay,
all right,
next
thanks
question.
A lot, Chris.
Yeah.
Yes. So our next question is, what control can help to mitigate risks within the P2P process?
Yeah, we have a bunch of controls for P2P, and we'll actually go through those for our audience that's listening to the podcast. And we talked about the internal controls universe, and that's really establishing the proper approach to internal controls. And, you know, we mentioned tone at the top, and in my introduction, you mentioned my experience at WorldCom and making sure we established tone at the top and basically rebuilt the company. But with tone at the top, we want to make sure that companies establish a code of conduct that really communicates that tone at the top, and that really makes sure that the consequences of non-compliance to tone at the top is well communicated and understood. The third control is segregation of duties. And segregation of duties, particularly in the P2P process, is established mostly in accounts payable and, of course, through P2P. But that establishes the controls to make sure that someone can't set up a vendor or supplier, pay that supplier, and then cover their tracks with a journal entry. Next is a delegation of authority. We want to make sure that the right people are signing off at the proper level of commitments and expenditures for the company. The fifth one is account reconciliations. We want to make sure that those are done on a monthly basis for all accounting processes related to certainly accounts payable and P2P. Next is system access controls. We want to make sure that those are set up on a monthly basis and are reviewed on a monthly basis, and certainly that those are addressed and upgraded and addressed and certainly revised if there's an operational change. We want to make sure that all internal controls are integrated into operations from a P2P perspective. And number 8, all representations and assertions, particularly in a Sarbanes-Oxley process, regarding internal controls are supported with appropriate documentation and audit trails. Number 9, costs and expenses of the department are under budgetary control. And this is really important from a finance and controller perspective. We've been doing a couple of very key webinars for the strategic CFO. Well, the CFO and controller own the budget, so we want to make sure that we've got good budgets for the P2P process and good controls for those. We must have a system of internal controls, needless to say, for the P2P process, and usually what we're saying in number 11 is that transactions within the organization's business process should be traceable and authenticated and have a good level of integrity within our specified delegation of authority policy. And moving on, usually background checks are conducted for all employees and contractors within the P2P process. 13, business records for accounts payable are maintained and kept safe in accordance with established policies, and data is considered confidential. We don't leave vendor records and certainly any payment records or payment mechanisms on our desks or leave them unsecured. And 15, computer systems and software applications must have their adequacy of internal controls checked with user acceptance testing. Contracts, documentation should have legal sign-off, and right to audit clauses should be in place. And number 17, if we're talking about suppliers and setting them up in our database, we should have the proper validation, which includes in the U.S. requiring W-9s and certainly from an international basis, W-8s and VAT checking and tax identification number checking, proper compliance screening depending upon your industry and your location, and really taking a look at the vendor address to make sure that vendor is a proper vendor and is a true vendor. Check out phone numbers and check out the company websites to make sure that it's a true vendor and not a phony vendor. And then the last 3 that are important to the P2P process to help prevent and deter fraud, we want to take a look at certain disbursements over a dollar amount. And what that is that we want to make sure that large dollar amounts aren't going out the door and being paid without proper management review, and that includes taking a look at international payments and of course wire payments. And the dollar amount you establish is going to be dependent upon the size of your company. And intercompany payables and receivables are reconciled, of course, on a monthly basis. And then last but not least, accounts payable in the P2P process usually have responsibility for P cards and corporate credit cards, and we find quite a bit of fraud and issues with the credit card process, and what really helps to prevent and deter fraud is to have a cardholder agreement in place, and that ensures that the cardholder understands their roles and responsibilities along with the consequences of noncompliance. So I know that's quite a long list, but those are the top 20 AP and P2P controls that really help get you in good shape and can help and deter fraud for the P2P process.
Thanks a lot, Chris. That was a very long list of P2P controls. So now let's talk about how automation can help to address and mitigate risk with the P2P process.
Yeah, again, very, very good question. And, I found, since I've been in this process for quite a while, and if we go back to our internal controls universe slide, many of these processes that we're looking at are, somewhat manual, and seeing the evolution, of, particularly automation, really moving the manual invoice processing initiative and the payment process to an automated process. We're really enhancing our internal controls universe, and we're taking away the manual efforts of keying in data. And as I mentioned, avoiding the capabilities of of having bad data, and if we want to enhance our universe with creating data correctly and automating our processes, what we're really doing is we're helping to enhance segregation of duties, and we're helping to alleviate risk by taking away the chance of somebody diverting, a manual document like an invoice or like a check or like a manual check. So automation with supplier portals, with e-invoicing, e-procurement, PO to invoice conversion, and certainly the self-audit capabilities that are there with the AP duplicate payment checks, and certainly the B2B directories that are now coming out. We're really looking at enhancing the universe for P2P, and anytime you have a chance to take away manual processing, you're enhancing controls because you're reducing risk and you have better control from an accounting perspective. So I love all the automation that is available today, and I think it's a wonderful chance for a company to take a look at how automation really in maybe 10 to 20 different ways, if we take a look at all our controls that we just talked about, how an automation solution can enhance all those controls. So very, very good question, and I think anyone listening to the podcast should take a look at the automation that's out there and how you can actually reduce risk by automating some of your P2P processes.
So Chris, in general, why does automation mitigate risk?
It really mitigates risk because you're taking out, that manual process. And, if we look at our universe, what makes up internal controls and really a company are really processes, systems, and entities. And if we take a look at our processes and we take a look at reducing the manual steps in a process, we're reducing risk. And, even, looking at, how many manual invoices are we processing today? And if we take a look at maybe a scorecard approach, how can we reduce those manual invoices? And if we take a look at, okay, what are the causes of maybe some duplicate payments and maybe some erroneous payments? And, we take a look at, okay, how are our suppliers being set up? Are we setting them up manually, or are they coming in through an intelligent supplier portal? So those are really two key ways where we can reduce risk in the P2P process.
All right. So can P2P controls be automated? And if yes, can you please tell us how?
Yes. In fact, that's a way that we can actually automate, controls. We talked about it a little bit with really a couple of things. Self-audit tools, for accounts payable, and that's kind of an interesting journey that the accounts payable and P2P process, have taken over the years. And, it's actually been a great enhancement with some of the new tools that are out there, even with artificial intelligence. And what's been happening is you take a look at your payment data, match it up against the historical database in your, basically your P2P ERP, whether it's, SAP, Oracle, whatever, and you take a look at the payments that are ready to be executed, and you determine, okay, is there a likelihood of any duplicate or erroneous payments that are going to be made for this payment run? And there's a chance to say, okay, let me stop this payment from going out in this payment run because it looks like it could be a potential duplicate. And duplicates are caught with fuzzy logic and algorithms which indicate that, okay, this is an easy one is the same amount to the same vendor for an invoice number that might have been modified somewhat for the same date. So those are, the easy one to catch. There could be crossovers where you could have a duplicate vendor. So you could have a vendor with a very similar name And that's why, you know, my premise is get your vendor master really clean, get it set up correctly, and you're going to have very few duplicate payments due to duplicate vendors. And I found that many duplicate payments are caused by duplicate vendors. So the self-audit tools can actually prevent a payment from going out the door if you're using it as a prevention mechanism. The other thing you can do is use it to go back and check your work and go and take a look at you know, what's going on in your payment history on a quarterly basis to see if you've actually caught all your duplicates. So rather than have a third party come in to check your AP payment history, check it yourself and see if you actually found any duplicates or if you found them all. And these tools can actually do wonderful things like metrics and you know, check your days payable outstanding, your cycle time. And again, the effectiveness of all these tools we're talking about are really all dependent upon the quality of your data. So again, going back to getting the data right is going to equal good audit results as well as good metrics and good analytics.
All right, Chris. So can you please tell us what are the best practices should a corporation consider to prevent risk?
Yes, some of the best practices to consider are make sure, number one, make sure you understand your P2P process. And don't look at things, you know, sub-processes in silos. And, you know, usually there's a little bit of animosity sometimes between finance and procurement because accounts payable and, you know, in the finance department may think that a lot of their problems, you know, are caused by purchasing, maybe creating a contract or PO with errors and you know, pricing problems. And establish partnerships and make sure you understand your process, make sure you understand the basics, and take a look at what you can establish as process improvements today. And the second thing is don't automate processes that may not be completely correct because you might be automating, you know, something that could cause problems down the road. And certainly as best practices, you know, make sure you have documentation in place, and the documentation, of course, should be written by the subject matter expert and reviewed by the business process owner, which is usually, you know, certainly the management team or director, and have that documentation certainly updated. So the documentation should correspond with a set of metrics, because metrics is really going to tell you what's going on in the process today. And it establishes baseline on where you need to go and what you need to correct. And it also shows you when, you know, we talked about automation quite a bit today, but it also shows you how automation has enhanced your process. And if you're looking at implementing an automation solution, many of the ones we talked about, it can actually help you create your business case and create the foundation for, you know, making your statement and also calculating your ROI. And then last but not least, create a control self-assessment. Doesn't have to be anything very voluminous or very, very fancy, but do the basics well, and then you can establish the baseline for your journey and get into a continuous improvement mode. So to summarize what I just said, understand your process, make sure you've got good documentation, and that will help you ensure that roles and responsibilities are well defined. Have a set of metrics, and make sure that you understand how everything connects together, particularly in the P2P process, and have a controlled self-assessment process. And that will help you get to the journey of fraud prevention and also continuous process improvement.
Thanks a lot, Chris. That was very informative. I hope our listeners now know a lot more about managing risk and the type of P2P controls which will be required to do that. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
On the show. Bye-bye.
Bye now. Bye now.